Good afternoon. This is Corey Ramsden from Solar United Neighbors. Thanks everybody for joining us on what is our first ever info session on storage. We're doing this as a webinar. We've got folks located all over the state, so we thought we'd do this online. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to be doing this info session presentation again at 7 p.m. tonight. So if you miss any of this or need to drop off, you're welcome to join us again. The content here is designed primarily for the Maryland program, but the majority of the slides are applicable broadly in the content, although there is some state-specific content for folks who are listening outside of Maryland. And just a little bit of housekeeping here before we get started. We're going to be, the presentation will run about 45 minutes. We'll have some time for Q&A. Please use your control panel there to ask questions. My partner here, Sam Polino, who's our Director of Co-ops, is going to be taking those questions, and he'll relay those to me, and we'll answer those as we go. Please feel free to fire those off whenever. We may hold those questions, some of the questions, till later in the presentation, but if it's relevant to our material, we might just ask those right now. So feel free to fire away. And we'll also be recording and putting this presentation on the website along with a copy of the slides after the presentation is complete. So a little bit about who we are. If anybody's seen our info sessions before in person, very similar information, but we just want to give folks a sense of kind of how we got here and what we're doing, why we're doing these presentations. So Solar United Neighbors, we're a network of folks who got started by helping each other install solar and generating our own electricity. We've been doing solar co-ops with neighbors and community members across 9 states over the last 10 years. We've grown steadily from a program that started in DC to one that has quite a bit more reach now. And we are helping people go solar primarily with what we call solar co-ops. And this is our attempt to use that model for folks who are interested in installing storage. So how did we get started? Back in 2007, we had our executive director, that's her son on the left there, and they went to go see An Inconvenient Truth. He got really excited, wanted to do something about it, and decided that they were going to install solar. When they went through and did the research, they realized that it was actually kind of complicated. There were a lot of different things that they had to work out, and Anya decided, well, if we're going to do this, let's do this as a group. So she asked the boys to try to recruit people. They went, knocked on doors, handed out flyers in their neighborhood in Washington, D.C. called Mount Pleasant. And after a couple of weeks, they had 40 people in the group. So that became that starting point ended up being the Mount Pleasant Solar Co-op, which was really a group of homeowners using their collective buying power to go solar as a group, to educate each other and to get some support from each other along the way. So that model, we think, will be helpful for folks who are interested in installing storage. So we're applying that here as well. Back then, there were only a couple companies in DC who were installing solar. There were a lot of different issues with permits and regulations and meters and billing and all sorts of things related to installing solar. And storage really is kind of where we think that's where the market is right now. So we think this is an important intervention for us to be able to help people go solar, or excuse me, to install storage together. So that's what we're about. This is a pilot program. We're testing it out in Maryland. So we're excited to be doing that here, close to where we got started. And we've got right now about 30 some odd people who have already joined the group. The group is still open for people to participate if they're interested. We're going to talk a little bit later about the co-op. But to get started, really, we're going to divide this presentation into 3 parts. The first part is going to be strictly about technology and how storage works for your home. Then we'll talk a little bit about economics and about our co-ops and what we're planning to do in Maryland. After each one of these, we'll pause. If anybody has questions that are relevant there, we'll take those. But again, feel free to use the Q&A section of your toolpad there and send us questions as they come up for you. So part 1, technology. One thing we want to make really clear for folks is that energy storage can do a lot of different things, from providing backup power to supporting the expansion of renewables on the grid. However, it's really important for you to understand that right now in Maryland, the only thing that energy storage can do for you is to provide backup power. It's not going to make any money. It's not going to produce cheaper electricity like solar does. In fact, if you have solar, the solar impact of the solar is actually going to be lessened just a little bit because it's going to use some of that electricity to keep your batteries topped off. That's part of what we'll talk about a little bit later as far as how the systems are constructed. But the main point here is we just want people to be super clear that this is about installing storage to provide backup power for your house in the event of an emergency. Now, there are some other things that are relevant for other markets where storage might have a broader purpose. But for the purpose of this webinar, we're keeping it strictly focused on backup power. If you have questions about those other types of uses for storage, please let us know. We'll probably do some follow-ups on those in the future. Right now, batteries, what we're really talking about is something that's very similar to a generator. So your standard fossil fuel power generator is going to power some or all of your home when the power is out. And the energy storage or the battery backup storage is really doing the same thing. It's coming on, it's only being used when the power is out. There's going to be some equipment there that's going to sense when the power is out, and it's going to flip it to the battery storage, and it's going to power some of your home loads from that storage. If you are thinking about backup power for your home, part of the reason why we think this is a better way to go is because you're able to power these with the combination of solar for using the sun essentially as the fuel for your backup generator. It may not be the cheapest option out there. We do recommend, if you're looking at backup power, to at least price out other fossil fuel power generators so you get a sense of what the difference is. But if you do feel strongly about powering your backup needs from renewable sources, solar plus storage is a great way to do that. One thing we also want to be clear about here is that off-grid, you'll hear that term a lot. We're not really talking about off-grid purposes for storage in this webinar. This is for people who are providing backup power to a home that's tied to the grid. The technology and a lot of the things are very similar, but designing a system for off-grid storage where there is no electric service from the utility is a very different proposition and one that we're not covering as part of this webinar. So what can you use it for? Your batteries are going to be powering some of your home when the grid is out if you decide to go this route. It's usually not economical for people to install storage to cover their entire house, their battery storage. So what you'll end up doing most likely is selecting some loads to cover when the power is out. And they call that either a backed up or a critical loads subpanel. The installer is going to come with an electrician. They're going to relocate some of the circuits in your house, the ones that you want to cover with in the event of an outage, to this subpanel. When the grid goes out, your backup system is going to disconnect that subpanel from the grid and power it from your battery storage. When the power comes back on again from the grid, it'll shut off and go back to normal operation. So that's one thing that you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about battery storage is what's really important to you. What do you want to cover in your house when the power is out? With that in mind, some examples here. This is a fictional family, the Johnsons, and this is just an example of a smaller size battery bank and the types of things that you could cover from it. It's really important for people who are thinking about storage to set your expectations appropriately about how much you can power relative to the cost. And that's something the installer is going to figure out with you. They're going to provide a proposal regardless of whether you use the co-op or not. That's a combination of your budget, what kind of system you want to, or what kind of loads you want to cover when the power is out, and also to some degree how much space you have available in your home or outside that's going to be suitable for storage. And we'll talk about that a little later. Realistically, most of these systems are probably only going to cover a couple of circuits in your house. And here are some examples that you can see on this slide. You're really talking about powering some essential loads like lighting, some convenience charging, some equipment in your home like maybe digital equipment like your cable modem or other things, your refrigerator, and maybe some small cooking appliances. But the amount of electricity you would need to power a stove, electric stove, a dryer, or an electric water heater, for example, that might be more than you can afford to install. That's part of, again, what you'll discover as you work through it with your installer. So how does this work with solar in particular? Solar is really what you can think of as solar is the fuel that keeps these batteries charged up whenever the power is out. And when the power is on, the solar is keeping them ready to go. Just like a generator, when the power goes out, your batteries are going to kick in. There's no need to flip switches. The power just comes on instantaneously, powers parts of your house that you've chose to run from those batteries. The solar is going to charge your batteries by day and power your house when there's excess energy. The batteries are going to power your house by night and when there's not enough solar power to meet your energy needs while the grid is down. When the grid comes back up, the batteries shut off and things go back to normal. So really, again, main point here is that solar is acting as the fuel in this situation to power your batteries. And you can have storage without solar and just power it from the grid. That will give you a limited runtime when the power is out. But for the purpose of this co-op, we're helping people who have solar add storage to that installation. So how do we size this? How do you come up with the right size? Installer is going to help you size your system appropriately, but there are some terms you think you should be aware of. So at the end of the day, we want you to leave this presentation and for others to make sure that you have some education about the types of language that will be used in interacting with installers. One is energy. So this is how much the batteries can store to power your house. This is measured in kilowatt hours. This is what you buy on your electricity bill. The other is the ability for that battery to do a certain amount of work in a certain time period, right? So you can think of the power as how much can you run at one time for the batteries. Just to give you a little bit of an example, if you had a 100-watt light bulb, for example, and you ran it for 25 minutes, and you ran a 1500-watt microwave for 1 minute, they're going to use about the same amount of energy. But if you ran them both at the same time, they would require more power than if you ran each one separately, individually. So those are things that the installer needs to take into account. You don't need to necessarily dig too much into the details here, but we do want you to be aware that some of it is about how much energy is stored in the battery, and some of it is about how much it can provide at any given moment. With that in mind, so one thing also to be aware of in terms of terminology is you might hear your installer talk about how the system is connected to your home. And there are two main ways that that'll happen. One is called AC coupling, and that's where the batteries and the inverter that goes with it is going to be connected directly to your home electric system, separately from your solar system. DC coupled is where the system is going to be behind your solar inverter. This topic gets very technical very quickly, but at a high level, we just want you to know there are two different ways that this typically happens, and depending on which type you choose, it might impact the incentives that are available, and also if you already have solar, certain ones might be more likely than others. But again, your installer is going to help you figure out the best way forward in terms of how your batteries are connected to your electric system and to your solar array. So this is a fun one. Everybody wants to know kind of what batteries are out there. There's a lot of coverage about lithium-ion batteries, about the Tesla Powerwall, which is a lithium-ion battery. But there are really two main technologies that you'll see on the marketplace right now for backup power for batteries. One is the tried and true lead acid, and those are going to have a lower upfront cost. They've been around for a long time, and they have some different maintenance requirements. They also potentially have a shorter lifespan depending on what they're being used for. On the other side, you've got a newer technology, lithium-ion, that has some more power per in density, which means there's more of it that's in square footage of the unit. It also has potentially lower lifetime costs because they tend to last longer. But again, depends on the design, and they do have a higher upfront cost right now, although those costs are dropping. There are also a number of other technologies that are out there that we're not going to cover in this particular webinar, but these two are the ones that are most common. One thing I also want to point out is that the lithium-ion battery, there are a couple different varieties of it. And just for this, just to keep in the back of your mind that there's a common version that people often associate with what they call thermal runaway, which are the Samsung batteries, for example. And there are a couple of options out there for that. There are no examples that we've seen where there've been any sort of safety issues with home storage, but it's the same battery chemistry. And then there's another version that's considered a little bit more stable, but also comes at a higher price tag. So just something else to consider. And for the co-op, we'll definitely be digging into that a little bit more based on the offerings that are available from the installers that are providing pricing.
Yeah, Corey, before we get too far away from the DC-AC coupled, it looks like we have a question from Carrie. She asks, does DC coupled mean that batteries cannot charge from the grid?
When the system is DC coupled, the power is going to come from the solar panels. Depending on the inverter, there may be an option to pull power from the grid to charge those batteries. That's going to depend on the equipment they select. But primarily, yes, that equipment is being charged from the solar array. Okay, so for this slide here, thank you, by the way, great question. Here for this, excuse me, for this slide, we're talking about the two common types of battery technologies out there. And for the co-op, we'll certainly be asking a lot of those questions in more detail. Space requirements. So lead acid batteries are going to be a number of them kind of a little smaller size, and they're connected together to form a larger unit that is usually customized to what energy you need in your house. They tend to be pretty heavy. Both of these technologies can be quite heavy. They're going to usually sit on the floor or maybe on a rack that's been constructed, like this picture you see here. Lithium ion, they're going to come packaged in a unit that's coming from the manufacturer that can be connected together, like these two Tesla Powerwalls you see here, or act individually for serving the energy needs of a home. And these units can also be placed outside in some situations, although it does depend on the manufacturer and the location. Speaking of which, for siting considerations, batteries are going to function best when they're in an environment where there's not a lot of wide range of temperature swings, and that they're pretty stable in a kind of a 50 to 80 degree temperature range. But there are some that can be stored outside. The Tesla Powerwall, for example, and the LG Chem batteries, which are both lithium ion, they can be installed outside in certain conditions. The lead acid batteries in some situations may also require ventilation, although the types you'll see for battery backup storage usually don't. That is something that can be specific to particular jurisdictions. So that's something the installers are going to help work out with you, is what's the most appropriate place to put these in your home or outside, and what those trade-offs are for doing that. So warranties. The warranties are going to pretty standard for lithium-ion batteries. We've seen they all seem to have a 10-year warranty, but there's some variations on those warranties with respect to how many cycles the battery can run. And by cycle, I mean the number of times that you draw energy from it and then charge it back up again. That's considered a cycle. So if you're powering your home for a day with no charging of the battery, that would be a cycle. You charge it back up again, and that would count as one. But 10 years seems to be pretty standard for lithium-ion batteries. For lead acid batteries, it's a little less standard, but it's roughly 2 to 5 year range. And the warranty that goes on the installation is separate. So just like your solar installation, you might look at the labor warranty or the installation warranty, the workmanship the installer is doing to create that system and assemble those parts. That's something that's a separate warranty that comes from your contractor that you want to ask about, in addition to the equipment warranties that are going to be available. Depending on the system, the inverter is either going to be part of the storage unit, or it might be a separate component. If it's a separate component, then it would also have its own manufacturer's product warranty associated with it. Some other considerations. Insurance. Just like solar, we tell people if you're thinking about installing solar, call your insurance company, ask how that impacts or if it impacts your rates. Same thing here with battery storage. You want to let your insurance company know you're considering it and understand whether there's any riders or special coverages or things you need to add. We don't have a lot of information about that at this point. This is a relatively new subject for us. So if you have called your insurance company and asked that question, please let us know. We would like to be able to track this as part of our co-op as well. At the end of the day, give them a call, find out for yourself, for your company. Permitting requirements. Storage is new all over the country in terms of its popularity. It's expanding, but it is still relatively new, which means that jurisdictions who permit these installations are probably going to have some questions or maybe be a little slower to deal with it in some situations. That's one thing we want to discover through this co-op, but keep in mind as well, regardless of where you are, that you may run into a couple extra hoops with the permitting jurisdiction, just because they haven't necessarily done a lot of these yet. Same thing is true for your utility. Because this is backup power, we don't expect that there'll be need for utility approval, but that might vary by the utility. The system is supposed to be not producing energy back to the grid in this situation, so there shouldn't be a problem there, but that's something we're going to find out. We want you to be aware as well that there might be some restrictions there. Next, installer qualifications. How many installations have they done? Batteries are pretty new. What kind of technologies have they installed with? Have they done anything in your area? Do they know anything about the permitting requirements that are necessary? These are all good things to ask your installer, and it's also something we're going to navigate through this co-op as well. But you do want to also clarify for them, to the next point is equipment availability. So this equipment, especially lithium-ion equipment, is not unique, not consistently available everywhere. Just to give you a small example, in Florida, there are Tesla Powerwall, the units that are essentially being routed to Puerto Rico for the recovery efforts there, which makes them scarce in Florida. These are things that are outside of a local contractor's control in many cases, but so you do want to ask what the likelihood is that the equipment you want is going to be available and when it's available. Again, these are also questions we're going to ask during that request for proposal for this co-op. And last but not least, we just want to acknowledge that EVs are also potentially a way to provide energy storage for your home as a backup generator. We're not going to be covering that in this co-op or really in this presentation, but we did want to acknowledge that if that is an option that sometimes is available, that you should research that very carefully with your manufacturer to make sure that you can do that safely and that you're not voiding any warranties for your electric vehicle. We have heard of folks who have done that before, so we just want to call it out. But again, do your research, make sure that you're doing it in a way that's safe and that doesn't void your manufacturer's warranty. So I'm going to pause here just for a second because we finished the technology part and see if we have any other questions that have come through. And for folks that are asking a little more technical questions that might require a little more explanation, we will be following up with you separately on that, but please keep the questions coming. In the interest of time, we're going to move on to the economic section, but if you have other tech questions that occur to you, fire away. Installing storage with solar versus later. So this particular co-op, people are installing storage rather, and they already have solar. So this is the later category, but we do want to talk about when you're installing storage and solar at the same time, some of the things that you might take advantage of. One is obviously being able to provide backup power immediately, but also potentially reducing some of that labor cost. It's not clear that that's always going to be the case, but if you're asking an installer to do work, they're already coming to your home, there may be some advantages or some savings there. And then the second thing is a clearer path towards taking the federal tax credit. We're going to do another slide on this later on, but the short version of it is that in some cases, the solar federal tax credit is available for storage, but not always. When you're doing solar with storage at the same time, it's usually an easier path to take that credit. Now, on the other hand, installing storage later on. These battery technologies are changing rapidly, so waiting a little bit certainly does give you the option to see what else is coming out there. You potentially are going to need to install some additional equipment along with the storage, depending on the equipment options that are included. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, the inverter is included in the storage unit. Sometimes you're adding an additional piece. In other cases, you may actually have to replace your existing solar inverter, depending on its age and what its capabilities are. So we do want folks to be aware that that's a possibility as well. That's part of what the installer is going to evaluate with you. Excuse me. And then last, I mentioned earlier, the eligibility for the federal tax credit is uncertain there, depending on how your system is configured. So just looking at pricing and kind of digging in a little bit, we try to break this down into these three sections here. The hardware, by hardware, we mean the actual storage unit itself, the batteries. Installation is the work that the contractor is doing on your behalf, as well as any additional components they need to install for that battery system. And then lifetime maintenance, we're really just kind of including as a catch-all to acknowledge that these technologies are relatively new. You might need to call somebody in a year or two to have your system looked at, or maybe you've run into a problem, and that's going to have a cost. So we just want to account for that to some degree. If you break that down with some examples here, on the left, you'll just see some common lithium-ion examples plus a sealed lead acid system as a comparison. And those are the system costs for those units. And these are list prices or close to it. We tried to approximate. They're not 100% accurate, but we tried to get them as close as we could just to give you a general frame of reference. Installation costs are also going to vary by region, but we've gotten some feedback that we think this is a reasonable range for the Maryland area, depending on the system chosen and the other equipment that's needed. Just to give you an example, if you have to install an extra inverter with your storage unit because there's not one integrated into it, that might be an additional cost. But when you add all that together, roughly $10,000 to $12,000, we're kind of putting it in the middle, would be enough for a kind of a medium-sized system to power your loads. Once again, just want to reinforce what's going to be done for you is going to be specific conversation with your installer about what you're trying to cover, what your budget is, the space you have available. If you're doing it within the context of our co-op, the pricing and everything will be identified, but they're still going to mix and match that to meet your needs, just like they would with solar. Next, we just want to reinforce for people at this point, since we're talking about economics, that this is about backup power. There's a lot of coverage out there for other markets in the country, California, or maybe for businesses who have demand charges where it's a little unclear whether backup power is the only reason people are installing storage or whether there's some economic benefit. For residential homeowners in Maryland and in all the states where we operate anyways, installing storage is about providing backup power in the case of an outage. There are no regulations in place in these states that will allow you to create an additional savings like you would with solar and net metering, for example. So we just want to be super clear about that and set people with expectations. That doesn't mean that that won't happen in the future, but right now the conditions are such that if you're installing batteries, you're doing it because you want to keep some of your lights on when there's no grid power happening in your house. So let's dig a little bit more into the federal tax credit since we're talking about economics. Our best understanding of this at this point is that the federal tax credit for solar is available for storage systems if it can be demonstrated that that system is charged by solar at least 75%. As you can see from the slide here, at 100%, you can take the full 30% of that tax credit. We did recently hear some news, actually just today, that there was a private letter ruling that was released by the IRS that did confirm that retrofits for storage are also covered for this. Now, it was a private letter ruling, so it's not broad precedent that can be cited, but it is an indication of where the IRS is thinking in terms of systems that already have, homes that already have solar, adding storage should make them capable to take that storage with the 30% tax credit, assuming that that system is charged 100% from solar. Now, whether it's charged from 100% solar or not is when we get into the details about how that system gets retrofitted, whether you're replacing your existing inverter and adding storage behind it along with solar, whether you're adding a new inverter with storage and doing what's called AC coupling, which we mentioned earlier. All of those things are going to be related to whether you can take the tax credit. And that's part of, frankly, what we're going to figure out as part of this co-op is what that looks like and how that impacts people's ability to utilize this part of the credit. This part of the incentives that are available. The good news is that in Maryland, there is an additional credit that got passed last year. This is an income tax credit that was passed by the state of Maryland. It is a limited supply credit that's good for the next couple years, and it's 30% of the total storage cost, as you can see here, with a maximum of $5,000. So it's pretty sizable credit. What's slightly unfortunate about this credit is the system has to be fully installed before you can apply for the credit. And because it is a limited amount of money that's available, that does open the possibility that you might not actually get the credit. However, we talked to Maryland Energy Administration, and they indicate that they will be showing how much is available on this pool of money, which is about $225,000 that specifically is dedicated for residential storage. And they're going to be updating that number regularly. So for this purpose of this storage co-op in Maryland, we should be able to keep an eye on how much is still available. We do want to be clear, though, there are no guarantees that this credit's going to be available for folks. That's why we're trying to get through this co-op quickly so that we give people a better chance of taking advantage of it. Either way, it's a great opportunity, and Maryland is one of the first states in the country to offer this type of incentive. I'm going to pause there for a second, see if anybody has any questions about economics. Okay. All right. So last but not least, let's go into our co-ops. So we've already, as I mentioned earlier, we already do solar co-ops all over all the states where we operate, and we just thought this was a great opportunity in Maryland with the tax credit and with interest for people to join this group, and we're going to use kind of a similar process here, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So far, we have about 30 people who have joined the group, as I mentioned earlier, and I just think it's pretty great that we've got a majority of those people in those groups are people who have gone solar with one of our co-ops in Maryland, which I love. Looks like we've got a question coming in here.
Yeah, so we have two quick questions, Corey. Brett asks, can you repeat how much money you said is available for the Maryland storage program for the first one?
So the question is, how much money is available for the Maryland tax credit? For residential homes, the state has set aside $225,000 in the first year, and I believe that will be available in the successive years as well. The tax credit, I think, is available for 3 years, the next 3 years.
Thanks. And then the second one from Ken asks, so 60% of the total cost is available in the form of tax credits, correct?
Yeah, so the question is 60% available in tax credits? The short answer is, if you can take the federal tax credit and you get the Maryland tax credit, that would represent 60% of the system cost, yes. Great questions. So as I said, we've got almost, I think, 29, 30 people in this group. A lot of them are solar co-op members from the past, which I think is fantastic. You'll see this slide, looks pretty familiar to some of you. The process we're going through is very similar to what we've done for solar co-ops. We're trying to leverage what we already know how to do and apply it to storage. Step one here is learning about the co-op. If you're doing that right now, we highly encourage anybody who's in the co-op to listen to this webinar and to find out more information excuse me, about what we're doing and about storage before you go too far down the road. But we're not going to be doing any live presentations in person, so this is our attempt to make this information available to anyone in the state who decides to join the group. Number two is signing up. If you haven't already, there'll be a link at the end of this presentation to come to our website and join the co-op. We'll ask you some basic questions, and that'll put you in the group. This is for people who have already installed solar who want to add storage to their systems. Next, we'd love to have this group be as big as we can make it. We do want people to know that it's a pilot and that we are this is an experiment. But if folks are up for being in the lead as far as installing energy storage in Maryland, then we encourage people to join the group as long as they have solar. Next up is the RFP process. We're putting together a template right now that is kind of a modified version of what we've used for solar that's specific to storage. We're going to be circulating that to the installer community to get some feedback to make sure we're asking the right questions from their perspective. And then we're going to release that RFP sometime in the next couple of weeks. So right now, if you have any interest in providing some feedback on those materials before we release them, definitely get in touch. And if you are interested in being on the selection committee, also send us a message. We'll have some contact info at the end of the presentation for you. Once we've selected an installer, and by we, I mean the group. So just for folks who are not familiar, Solar United Neighbors does not make the selections in these groups. A volunteer committee gets together, they review all the bids. Solar United Neighbors is there to help them and provide technical support and facilitation, but ultimately it's the group members who volunteer to participate in those committees who are the ones that are selecting on behalf of the group. Once that selection is made, we will follow along the process from start to finish, make sure everybody gets a proposal, and then be there to provide whatever support we can. We're not entirely sure what the installation timeline looks like for storage, but I imagine it's probably a couple months at this point. It's unlikely to be more than solar, and solar is about 3 to 5 months. So we're probably looking at somewhere between 2 to 3 months, I would imagine, from the time you sign your contract until the time your system's up and running. But again, we're going to find that out as part of this group. Once your system's installed, we're going to make sure that everything is all squared away in terms of the paperwork you need along with the installer. We are going to ask them whether they're going to be filing that incentive for you or with your help, or whether you need to do that. That's part of the selection process. Excuse me, for that Maryland tax credit. And then last but not least, we would love to celebrate all the work that we're doing here. This is something that is probably extremely new all across the country as far as using the co-op model to do this, just because storage is new in general, and we are bringing it to Maryland first, so we're pretty excited about that. Most of this I've already talked about in terms of who can participate on this next slide here, but this is for existing homeowners, people who want to power their homes when there's no grid power available and you live in Maryland. And again, this is pilot. So why do you want to participate? We like to think that this is because this is a relatively new technology and there's a lot of unknowns here. Doing this as a group makes a lot of sense. We're able to support each other, educate group members about what's going on, but also intervene and look for solutions when we run into challenges. That's a lot of what we do at Solar United Neighbors, is helping people move forward and identifying problems and trying to come up with solutions, whether they're individual to that homeowner or whether it is something that needs to change at the state or local level in terms of policy. And lastly, we'd love to be able to show the state that this credit's working and it deserves continued support, because it is definitely going to encourage people to install solar throughout, or install storage rather, throughout the state. Timeline for this group. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to release the RFP very shortly. We'd love to have an installer selected by April, so everybody in the group can get moving and start getting proposals and thinking about their options. That way, people can get these systems installed and start applying for that state tax credit as soon as possible. And as I mentioned earlier, here's that information slide. Please, if you haven't signed up already, come to the link you see there. We're also going to post this on the website, and we'll follow up with a message to all attendees with this information as well, that has a link to the slides as well as a recording of this presentation and how you can join the group. We'd also love it if you joined our listserv, where we do a lot of technical questions and other help for homeowners. It's a really great community. It's about 700 plus people who are willing and ready to answer questions about solar and now about storage as well. And that is the end of our presentation. This is the first time we've done this, as I mentioned, so please send us feedback. If we didn't cover questions you wanted to hear answered, please let us know. We've got some time here if we want to answer additional questions. Looks like we've got about 15 minutes or so. So if you have questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A section, and we're available to answer those.
Great, thanks, Corey. Looks like we have one from Tom. He asks, if this year's $225,000 credit limit is reached before my system is completed, can I apply for the credit in 2019 for a battery backup system that went live in 2018?
Thanks, Tom. So the question is whether or not a system that goes live in 2018 can qualify for the 2019 credit. My understanding is no, but I think we need to double check that. I believe the system has to get a credit in the same year that it was installed. Now, there is a chance, because there is some money available for the commercial side, they will maintain a waiting list for that year. So if the $225,000 runs out, there's a chance that the remaining pool for commercial might be available, but that's a little bit of a question mark, because it's likely the commercial storage installations will probably use up all that money. So that's something that I've made a note of, and we'll find a better answer.
And we have another one from Richard. He asks, how does one determine the percentage of solar power for the purpose of the IRS tax credit?
So how does somebody determine the percentage of solar power used to charge the batteries for the purpose of the tax credit? We don't have a good sense of how that's done at this point. That's a technical question that we're a little fuzzy on. My guess is that the inverter that is used to charge the batteries and the inverters that are used to control the solar output need to record to some degree where that energy is flowing to. So I imagine there's probably some metering that has to happen within the storage system, but I don't have a good sense of that yet. That's something we need to understand better. Those are great questions. Just making some notes here. If other folks have questions, please let us know. We'll leave the line open here for another couple minutes, And if not, we'll wrap up, and our next presentation will be at 7 p.m. tonight. Same content for anybody that missed this one. All right, Sam's telling me that we've got no other questions. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. If you have any comments or feedback, like I said, please contact us, mdteam@solarunitedneighbors.org. We would love to hear from you. We want this information to be as useful as possible for homeowners and others who are considering installing backup storage for their properties. Thank you so much and have a great day.